Okay, so hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at this poll everywhere question. And so essentially it's you're trying to think of what are the typical types of symptoms that you might see in someone with schizophrenia, and then sort of think of something that is not characteristic of that. And so obviously A would be an example of a delusion, I hope, at least. And so that delusions are frequently seen in schizophrenic patients. Monotone unemotional speech is another very common symptom in schizophrenia. And that's because you have this emotional flattening effect where essentially it's like the dynamic range of your sort of emotions, or at least the expression of those emotions, is very sort of compressed. And so repetitive mannerisms are obviously also something that are frequently seen in schizophrenic patients. So the correct answer is C, because of that flattening of emotional effect. Yes? Not questions. Typically, I have a couple of not questions. So if I always capitalize all three letters of not to sort of, I think I've even bolded it sometimes, but it's just to try and stop just an automatic, recognition type click, like, so you actually think about it slightly. So, and talking about exam-related things, we talked about it just sort of a final reminder about tomorrow's quiz is obviously it's going to be those 6 classes, and you only have to answer 5. You're welcome to answer all 6 questions. If you get all 6 right, you'll still only get 5 points. But if you get, on the other hand, if you get one of them wrong, you can still get 100%. So they will all be multiple choice. Though that gives me an idea. Maybe the 6th question should be fill in. I'll call it Luke's question. What's that? Probably not. So today we'll be talking about sleep disorders and sleep. And sleep is a fairly odd thing if you sort of think about it. So this is a cartoon from, was it XKCD, and it's 2 people talking. Are you coming to dinner? Yeah, but first I'm going to go comatose for a few hours, hallucinate vividly, and then maybe suffer amnesia about the whole experience. Cool. And that is sort of like a kind of a quick summary of sleep, so we can go home now. So the first thing, obviously, to think about with sleep is, as you're well aware, most people tend to sleep at night and be awake during the day. Some people prefer to sleep during lectures, but we have, actually there was well, I guess he's now a 4th year, but there was one student who, for pharmacology lectures, which were at 1 o'clock, every single class he fell asleep. What's that? Well, neuropharmacology, but so the interesting thing about this is that we do have this day-night cycle, and it is regulated by sort of some fairly complex molecular and neuronal mechanisms. And people realize this pretty quickly because there's all kinds of physiological changes that occur during that day-night cycle. So, for example, we have fluctuations in blood pressure, throughout the 24-hour cycle. We have changes in our alertness. So typically, people are most alert in the mornings, and interestingly, the sort of most efficient sort of muscular activity tends to be sort of kind of later afternoon. And one of the other things that was fairly rapidly found was that there's this 24-hour pattern for melatonin secretion. So melatonin is the body starts to secrete melatonin before you fall asleep, and it stops secreting melatonin sort of when you're waking up. So that's clearly directly involved in our sort of sleep-wake cycle. And now that it's sort of, now that we know more about the neuronal circuitry, we know that melatonin induces sleepiness by reducing an alerting effect from this brain region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And the secretion of melatonin is suppressed by light. And the way that works is that there is a direct connection of the optic nerve to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is then detecting the presence of light, and that is then regulating our body clock. This is why it's like not a good idea to sort of be right before falling asleep looking at a bright screen or something like that, because your body is thinking, oh, it's daylight still. So we have this circadian rhythm that can be tracked for a lot of different things, and that obviously gives rise to our sleep-wake cycle. And it is actually directly relates to some molecular biology. And so this is the fruit fly version, because it uses a bit less than half of the number of proteins that the mammalian version uses. So, but the principle is very similar. And last year, the discovery of this, was recognized with a Nobel Prize in 2017. So, and so as I said, this is the fruit fly version. The names of the genes are a little bit different in mammals, and as I said, there are a lot more partners, but the sort of kind of idea is still conserved. So you can actually track the changes. There's a sort of a circadian rhythm for the changes in the abundance of a particular protein in these particular neurons that tracks with the circadian rhythm of the fly. And as I said, that we have the same basic mechanism, just with a lot more bells and whistles. So you can see this cycling of this period protein, abbreviated as PER. And obviously, it's a protein, so it's going to be dependent on mRNA levels. And the mRNA levels also show this circadian rhythm. So, and the mRNA levels peak, obviously, a few hours before the protein peaks, because you obviously have to convert one to the other. And it's a good example of a negative feedback model. So as the period protein builds up in cells, that starts to reduce the mRNA expression of reduce its own mRNA expression. And the protein itself is then regulated by light through its regulation to this timeless protein and this cryptochrome C-cry gene. So this timeless protein also has this 24-hour cycle, and timeless binds directly to period, and it allows the period protein to build up by blocking its degradation. So when in response to light, timeless becomes degraded, leading to the degradation of the period protein by a protein called double time. And so that then goes down. So you have these different proteins cycling and regulating their expression in response to light. And so that's what's then giving rise to this circadian rhythm. And obviously, because the sort of place where the circadian rhythm gets really entrained in humans or mammals is, like kind of deep within the brain. We can't have like this going on sort of with direct regulation by light. We have to sort of have a neuronal signal that's transferring the light information. So that's the sort of like at least a little bit of the detail, sort of molecular detail of how we sort of get this circadian rhythm. And there are more neuronal circuits that are responsible for this. One of the important aspects of this, so here's the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is part of this process. And the hypothalamus plays a major role here. And so we don't just have, like sleep versus wake. We don't sort of like, we're not like asleep and then bam, we're awake and then we're asleep again. There's this sort of cycling of sort of different levels of alertness. Do you have a question? What's that, sorry? The limbic system, the hypothalamus. So a lot of it takes place within the hypothalamus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is sort of like, quote unquote, the master clock. We actually have a bunch of other little independent circadian rhythm generators in our bodies as well, which is probably why you can get so badly messed up in sort of like jet lag and things like that. But the suprachiasmatic nucleus, yeah. And but yes, the limbic system does play a role. Even things like energy balance actually will have an impact on our sort of sleep-wake cycles. But in terms of alertness, which is obviously a key part of being awake, a lot of that is being driven by these orexin-secreting neurons. And so these orexin-secreting neurons secrete orexin, which then interact with other pathways, in particular using sort of dopamine type signaling. And they then act to sort of promote activity in the cortex and the thalamus and so on. During sleep, these orexin neurons are inhibited. And so they're no longer producing the orexin peptides to activate sort of alert states within the brain. So we lose our alertness and we are able to fall asleep. And obviously the thalamus is a major part of this, because the thalamus is the bit that obviously is acting as this sensory gateway. And so if the thalamus is, like if you think simplistically, if the thalamus is inhibited, then we're not going to be getting any sensory information into the brain, and therefore we are able to sleep, because obviously if we're fully aware of everything that goes around us, you'd have a hard time actually sleeping. A second system that is also important in both important in regulating wakefulness and pharmacologically important. Oh, yes. So there are, I don't actually know if anyone has done any detailed studies where they're trying to track the depth of people's sleep together whilst doing, it would be difficult, probably, it might be doable now with fMRI, like if you did have a large enough study, but to my knowledge, I don't think, there is more and more fMRI stuff done, but it's difficult to get people to sleep in an MRI machine because they're super loud, so and not particularly relaxing. But in principle, you could do an experiment, but I don't think it's very easy to look at the levels of brain activity, at fine detail, like in that kind of way. So, but in principle, it would be interesting to sort of know if there was some correlation in activity in particular brain areas and depth of sleep, individual depth of sleep. Yeah. So yeah, this second area that is important, especially pharmacologically, is also in the hypothalamus, but it's the histamine secreting neurons. And so your brain releases histamine during wakefulness as part of that wakefulness. And this is why antihistamines, especially those that with significant penetration into the brain, cause you to become drowsy, is because they're obviously inhibiting that histaminergic signaling. So the question is, how much sleep is enough? And since you're all in pharmacy school, I'm guessing you probably none of you actually have enough sleep. But the amount of sleep that different people have varies dramatically. This is sort of, the one study. Typically, if you're sort of down in this, region down here, then that's very unhealthy. If you're in this region up here, you're probably retired or something like that. Certainly you don't have a family. But the mean seems to be sort of, like the sort of healthy mean seems to be around about this sort of 8-hour kind of per night type area. Yes.
Severely reduced cognitive capability.
Yes, there are plenty of studies showing that sort of like being even like an hour or so down on sleep will produce measurable drops in your sort of cognitive flexibility and so on. So try and get sleep, especially before exams. Yes. So that is an interesting one, because some cultures do have like the kind of siesta type idea, and I think it's more like you need sort of like your 8 hours in a 24-hour period. So yes, if you take a couple of hours sleep, like at 2 o'clock or something like that, then you would need less at night. And so it's a different pattern that like might actually be more attuned to our physiology, because obviously back in hunter-gatherer times, like no one had to get up for 8 o'clock classes. So since we seem to spend a third of our time asleep, one would assume that it has some significant purpose, because like you don't generate such a complex behavior just for the hell of it. And in general, through the sort of animal, the different types of animals, the majority of them do sleep. For example, dolphins spend about the same amount of time sleeping as we do, like about a third of their time. They have the ability to sleep sort of half their brain at a time, which is probably something to do with the fact that if they were completely asleep, they would drown. So, we don't have that problem. So, but they can literally switch sleep one half of the brain at a time. And so it's this highly conserved phenomenon, and it's generally thought to actually have a bunch of different purposes. So ranging from memory consolidation through sort of especially brain metabolism, through even changes in the immune system. And one of the theories is that the restorative aspect of sleep may be due to sort of a switching of the brain into a functional state that's related to essentially house cleaning, sort of reducing the degradation products of neuronal activity that accumulate during sort of normal cognition and wakefulness. And I think it's about 10 years ago, there was some interesting work done that actually suggested that this is actually not really a hypothetical thing. It's actually a real, there's sort of real experimental evidence for this. And so these are experiments done where they actually trained mice to fall asleep on a microscope, and which presumably took a while. But what they found, though, was that essentially there were structural changes like at a microscopic level in the mice brains, so that there was essentially during sleep, the neurons and glial cells would actually physically shrink to create more extracellular space. And then there was during sleep, there was this improved perfusion of that extracellular space, so that it was actually allowing a lot more clearance of sort of metabolic byproducts and so on from the brain during the sleep state. And then when they woke up, then the cells would snap back to their sort of old size, and like you'd have much less extracellular space and greatly reduced perfusion through that extracellular space. And this is driven by the activity of these water channels called aquaporins. And interestingly, they also found if they used mice models for, I think it was Alzheimer's disease, where like amyloid type mice, where they accumulated these amyloid plaques, they found that during the sleep state, they actually got better clearance of those plaques than they did in the awake state. So there was actually some evidence that there really was a change in the ability of the brain to kind of flush out bad stuff during sleep. So that presumably is the kind of thing that would only happen in really deep sleep, which brings us to this idea of that we have different levels of sleep. And so this is a chart of like an individual sleeping for roughly 8 hours. And here we have different stages of sleep. So wakefulness, and then stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and then REM sleep. And if you're also tracking body movement, you'll see that sort of a lot of the time that it's seen in the REM sleep stage and not so much in some of these other stages. And by body movement, I'm not talking large movements, just sort of just small ones. The other thing that you can see from this is that in the early stages of sleep, you spend quite a lot of time in the deep stage 4 stage of sleep. Presumably that would be where we have those sort of architectural changes in the brain to allow flushing out of all the gunk. And as sleep progresses, we spend less and less time in that deep, deep sleep and more time in REM sleep and in some of the lighter stages of sleep. So what are these stages of sleep if we were trying to describe them? So we have wakefulness, which is the kind of drowsy, sort of just about falling asleep kind of stage. And then we have 4 stages of REM sleep. And about 3/4 of the sleep cycle is going to be non-REM sleep. So, REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. So about 1/4 of it will be in REM sleep, 3/4 in non-REM sleep. So we talked about them having stages. So stage 1 is the lightest form of sleep. And so this is where we're transitioning from wakefulness to very light sleep. It's not a big contributor to our overall period of sleeping. We have muscles and respiratory rate sort of becoming more and more relaxed, but at this stage it's easy to wake someone who's asleep. And it's also the stage where you get this sort of hypnic jerk, which is where like suddenly someone wakes up with a kind of start and a sensation of falling. And if you sort of were able to sort of peel back someone's eye while they're in this stage of sleep and they didn't manage to wake them up, then you'd often see that they'll sort of kind of have rolling eye movements. Stage 2 is one of the sort of time-wise is one of the big contributors to sleep. And this is where we have all cessation of any eye movements, and we have started to see major changes in the EEG brainwaves. And starts off with, so we have in this sort of sleep cycle, we have these sort of different stages where we kind of go down and up and down and up. In the first of these sleep cycles, we're going to sort of have like 10 to 20 minutes in stage 2, but it lengthens with each successive cycle. And will eventually be sort of about half of the sleep cycle. So in stage 3, there's more of a kind of transition to deep sleep. And so this is where people get harder and harder to wake up. And then stage 4 is very deep sleep. And if you sort of are woken up from stage 4 sleep, typically you'll be very, groggy and disorientated. Don't know about individual variation, but there are a lot of sleep aid drugs cause drastic changes in sleep architecture. And so that, in terms of amount of time spent in different sleep stages and time to those sleep stages and so on. And so that's why a lot of people will argue that even if you take like a Z drug for sleep, it's the quality of the sleep is not there because it's dramatically changing the way in which you're going through these sleep cycles. REM sleep is different, and it's regarded as being the equivalent to sort of dream, the sort of sleep equivalent of the dream, which obviously happens inside your head. And if you look at someone who's having REM sleep, obviously its name is rapid eye movement sleep, and so they have rapid eye movements, particularly sort of fluttering of the eyelids, muscle paralysis, irregular breathing, and changes in sort of heart rate and blood pressure and so on. It's often also called paradoxical sleep because the brainwave activity looks somewhat like you'd see in someone who's actually awake. And so that's about a quarter of the sleep cycle. And so this table just kind of summarizes some of the differences between non-REM and REM sleep. So if we're talking about brain activity, we see this steady decrease from wakefulness. Whereas in REM sleep, we have upregulation of brain activity in many areas, including motor and sensory cortex. Even though obviously we're still at the point where we're having our sort of thalamus switched off, so that they're not receiving any sensory information. This is why, you know, like you're actually, when you're dreaming, you've obviously have imaginary sensory information. Non-REM sleep, you'll have a slow heart rate. REM sleep, the heart rate rises, and yes. So a lot of, well, I don't know how many people, like, you sort of like saying, so the purpose of dreaming is not particularly clear. Generally, it's thought to be related to, you know, like emotional processing and things like that. In terms of, I don't believe someone can choose to dream about a certain thing, but they can influence dreams when they're in them. And that probably is just dependent on the amount of cortical activity that's going on. So you could be completely passive in the dream, or you can sort of like have an influence on it. And so that will kind of vary, I would imagine, individual by individual, and probably dream by dream too. But yes, and that comes down to here as well. So there's a lot more sympathetic tone going through the body as a result during REM sleep. And that relates to, and also that will raise blood pressure dramatically. But there's no muscle tone, or to speak of, because you're like, you're fully paralyzed at this point. Because obviously you don't want to be, you know, if you're having a, I don't know, karate dream, you don't want to sort of be injuring anyone who might be around you. So we have this sort of paralysis, and this is why sort of when things get, you know, you can have situations where someone can wake up and still be paralyzed because it has, that hasn't gone yet. Yes. So the sort of the like twitching that sort of dogs have when they're asleep is just incomplete paralysis. So and we sort of will often have like little, like the eyelids fluttering and things like that. So it's not perfect paralysis, but it's pretty good. Sleepwalking is essentially a failure of that, and there are complicated. I don't think there's a good explanation for, you know, like why it does happen to some people, but yes, it's fundamentally it's the failure of the paralytic mechanisms that gives rise to someone able to sort of at least partially act out their dreams physically, rather than, you know, like whether. So it's basically, if, you know, like 99.9% of the time everyone, you know, like is fully paralyzed, but when that system isn't working perfectly, then you start seeing simple behaviors like sleepwalking, but they can get more and more complicated. And if you're sleep deprived and things like that, that can also mess with that as well, and drugs. Yes. Yes, exactly. It's it's because it's exactly the same in the sense that you're still talking about essentially neuromuscular transmission, and so it's basically the thalamic block, if you like, for sleep is what's preventing sensory information going in, but also muscle commands coming out. Yes.
So besides like the level of sleep deprivation a person is experiencing, why do some people, why some people tend to be able to fall asleep a lot faster than others? Because like obviously you can say one's more tired than the other, but I feel like just how people.
Yes, I think that would be it's a difficult thing to sort of properly study because you can't, there's too many things you can't control. So, if I had to speculate, I would suggest it's all down to sort of like level of alertness and ability to control alertness. So if you're stressed, then you're more likely to be sort of like thinking about things and worrying about them, and then you'll have trouble sleeping. If you sort of practice, genuinely practice sort of like meditations and things like that, then you probably have more of an ability to sort of switch off some of that stuff, and then you can enter that quiet wakefulness and drift off to sleep more effectively, I suspect. But then again, it may be tied. Maybe not everyone can meditate. I don't know. I've not ever tried like a full meditation. So yes, everyone can do that, but then they have messed up sleep cycles. If they do it to sleep, but so we have those changes in physiology that you see during REM sleep, and you have big changes in the sort of regional blood flow in REM sleep, and typically in non-REM sleep you get this slower and slower respiratory rate compared to REM sleep, where you might start breathing more rapidly, and all down to this increased sympathetic tone. And one thing that's interesting is that, so in non-REM sleep, we have a movement of our thermoregulation set point. Like like the body has its temperature that it wants to sit at, and it sort of cranks it down during sleep, just like we might crank down a thermostat in a house during the night. And but the body does that also, so the body temperature falls. But interestingly, in REM sleep, the part of the brain that's responsible for that set point, it actually completely switches off. So for the period we're in REM sleep, we actually have unregulated body temperature. It's only like obviously short periods, but it's kind of interesting. We can see a lot of this with EEGs, which obviously are less likely to just wake you up than an MRI is. And you've seen some of this in the epilepsy class. So obviously we have our awake brain pattern. Then as you get drowsy, you start seeing more of this sort of these alpha waves. And in stages 1 to 3 of sleep, you get these theta waves. All of these these are sort of similar amplitudes, but you have changes in frequency. And in stage 2, we start seeing these other aspects of the EEG, which include these sleep spindles and K complexes. And they're sort of like just bursting activity that is like occurring and can be seen in the EEG. And these are thought to correlate to memory consolidation. Yes. I can't literally put every piece of information that's in the class on the exam, because otherwise there would be sort of like 500 questions, and I didn't know that I'd even want to write 500 questions. So I could imagine, I'm not saying I will or won't, but I could imagine asking a question like, sort of what is the sort of characteristic EEG wave for deep sleep or something like that, and the answer to that would be delta waves and not alpha waves or something like that. So it is possible, but and then in REM sleep, you'll see these sort of this kind of pattern that you see down here, which is, like it does really look kind of like the same brain wave pattern that you'd see in when awake. So because we've actually been talking, I'm going to skip this section, which means no one gets called out. So at least. And we'll go talking a bit more about some other aspects of the role of sleep. So if you look at the amount of, and some, at least some aspects of the role of dreaming. So if you look at the amount of time that you spend dreaming as a sort of function of age, you'll notice that infants spend like a lot of that. I mean, they spend a lot more time sleeping than we do, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it. But they spend a lot of that sleeping time dreaming. And like if you have a sort of 2-day-old baby, obviously it's not processing lots of memory consolidation and so on, or for that matter complex emotions, because like it hasn't got the experiences that would require all of this consolidation. And so the thought is that the REM sleep at that period of development is actually important for actually essentially providing stimulation for different neuronal pathways to sort of enhance their development and sort of maturation. So it's almost like the brain is running sort of simulations of what it may come across, rather than what you'd see in adulthood, when those dreams, periods of dreaming and so on are probably more about, like emotional processing through existing pathways. So that's the theory as to why, like there is so much more REM sleep in infancy compared to adulthood, even though some of the experiences you might have in adulthood may be, like more complex. And we know that REM sleep is important because you can, for example, do like experiments on volunteers where you actually like they sleep, but every time they enter REM sleep, you wake them up. And so in that way, you can get someone to have like 8 hours of sleep, but no REM sleep. Yes. I don't think there's any situations where, so no one's obviously done it deliberately, I would hope. I don't think there are any, because babies are so good at falling asleep, I don't think there are examples where that would happen. I mean, it's like, I suppose, like something like a war zone or something like that might be a situation where you could have that, but then there'd be so many other things that could cause traumas that it would be hard to tease out that specific thread of it. So like there'd be so much other sleep deprivation that you wouldn't really be able to distinguish it, I think. But, oh, they do, absolutely, yes. Sleep deprivation. Yes, yes. And in the so in this specific example, however, it's volunteers, and it is just not for the purpose. So in sleep deprivation techniques, yes, you're exactly you're not preventing any sleep. You're not sort of like monitoring their EEGs and just removing REM sleep. Probably because the people who do that kind of thing aren't necessarily interested in being subtle.
It's kind of impractical. It's like, are you going to keep electrodes?
Well, I mean, you could, but yes.
And then you wake them up.
Yes,
So
but
easier just toss a flashbang in there as soon as he falls asleep. Oh, yeah.
yes, I actually we'll talk about it's yes. Sleep deprivation itself won't kill you, But if you deprive someone of REM sleep, you'll see that as soon as they have the opportunity to sleep undeprived, like almost their entire night will be REM sleep, because they're, like, just because it's like your brain is determined to get it. Yes. What's that? Or yes. Yeah. And so, yes, I mean that's like in the cartoon right at the beginning. Like have amnesia possibly have amnesia about the whole thing. You sort of, I think it's estimated you have like dozens and dozens of dreams every night. But if you get woken up during REM sleep, you'll typically remember that one. And so like in some cases, obviously you could have a bad dream, wake with the start. That one dream will be really vivid. But yes, you'll probably have had like many dreams through the night, but most of the time you don't remember them. Okay, this is just to remind you of the problems with sleep deprivation. And so, for example, this is an example. This was the Challenger space shuttle disaster back in the 80s. Where it exploded a couple of seconds after it launched. And many of the managers involved in sort of running the shuttle program had been sort of, like working, like completely around the clock to sort of make sure everything was, running perfectly smoothly. And so they were operating on a couple of hours sleep. And so they made mistakes that led to the accident. And so this is just a, a famous example where, like just because people have good expectations, good intentions, like trying to sort of do without sleep is never the most efficient way of sort of running things. And it applies to you guys too, in the sense of exams, where it's probably not a good idea to sort of try and have only 2 hours of sleep before you take an exam, just because you want to get the studying in. You'd probably do better with a full night's sleep and a bit less studying. There are also many health consequences of going without sleep. So if individuals sleeping less than 7 hours per night will typically have, health issues that come on from this, which include obesity, increased risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and then cognitive symptoms like anxiety and depression, and actually reduced concentration as well. And in general, the greater the degree of this sleep deprivation, the greater the degree of the resultant health manifestations. And so you won't die, however, if you don't have any sleep. And based on those studies with the mice where they prevent them sleeping, I mean, they do survive quite a long time without sleep. And if you sort of scaled it up to a human lifespan, the suggestion is you could probably go somewhere between 2 to 10 years before you, in quote unquote, died from sleep deprivation.
But I mean, you'd be so
You'd probably wish you were dead pretty quickly.
like cooking breakfast and your stove would explode because you didn't realize the PATHO light wasn't lit.
Yes, definitely. And there is, although this again isn't like a model of sleep deprivation, there is actually a prion disease called fatal familial insomnia, where people once they develop symptoms, become completely unable to sleep, and they develop, like panic attacks and paranoia and phobias, which are probably related to the insomnia. But then they start having extensive brain damage and get hallucinations. Once they stop sleeping, they have rapid weight loss and generate dementia, and sort of typically will die within about a year of the onset of symptoms. It is not reversible. Yes, this is actually a familial prion disease. So you don't necessarily. So they're generating the prions themselves, But yes, but otherwise it would be similar to other prion diseases. Yes, sort of in terms of the mechanism of the pathophysiology, where you have these peptide fragments that induce changes in the matching quote unquote healthy peptides, and that leads to the neurodegeneration and so on. And sleep deprivation does lead to this sort of big increase in drive to essentially the stress axis, and suppression of growth hormone, and you get this reduction in concentration and cognition and memory and so on. And in many cases, yes. Yes, I did actually have that in an earlier one, but yes, I agree. It's there are immune consequences as well. And if you do sleep deprive people, they will start to develop microsleeps, which are sort of like can be as short as just a couple of seconds, where the brain will just like click into a sleep state for a couple of seconds at a time, and like they completely can't be controlled. And then again, this is why, for example, driving when you're sleep deprived is not the best plan, because if you're going 90 down a highway and fall asleep for 2 seconds, that's not going to end well. In rats, interestingly, they can actually, like dolphins can shut off half their brain at a time. Rats can actually have microsleeps in different regions of the brain at a time, in order to sort of combat sleep deprivation. And so there are obviously different types of sleep disorders. So we have a circadian rhythm type sleep disorders, and this is probably the delayed sleep phase disorder is the one most likely to affect you guys, because it's thought that over a quarter of high school and college students have been found to be sleep deprived. And basically it's difficulty falling asleep at sort of like, relatively early in the evening, meaning that you sort of don't fall asleep until, say, 2 in the morning, which means that if you have an 8 o'clock class, then you're going to struggle to fit sleep into that pattern. And so, yes.
Would that explain why some people, even though they're sleep deprived from the night before,
Still can't fall asleep?
Wide awake.
Yes, because and that's sort of like they're still on a 24-hour circadian cycle, but they have a delayed cycle. And so, if you, for example, like if they don't fall asleep till 2 in the morning, but they can sleep in till 10, then they're totally fine. But they get sleep deprivation if they, their alarm goes off at 6, and so now suddenly they've only had 4 hours of sleep, and that's never going to be a good system. Yes? It does not matter, except as far as your sort of employment and or education goes. So and that's where, it's the only reason you need to sort of help people with delayed sleep cycles is for fitting in with like other requirements. Yes.
Is there any mismatch with light exposure?
I'm not. Well, so yes, I think it can be worse in those situations, and there is actually an intrinsic. Obviously, there's an intrinsic cycling that goes on without any light exposure, and they've done studies where people are sort of essentially. Yeah, well, actually, it's depends on age. So yes, but I think it's longer. It's like 25 for sort of teenage to through early 20s, and then goes down to about 23 in the elderly population. But in terms of its free run cycling, yes. So you're not dependent on it. In terms of like interactions between this kind of delayed sleep cycle, this is often where things like interactions with, like phones and computers and TVs and so on come into play, because typically someone who's not falling asleep till 2 in the morning is probably not lying in a darkened room for about 6 hours, because they're really bored. And so if you're doing something with, they're getting that light stimulation. And conversely, the elderly often have the opposite problem, where in many cases they sort of will, kind of want to fall asleep at sort of 6 o'clock in the evening, and then wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then they can go talk to their grandkid, and they're sort of complete the cycle. Jet lag is similar, as is shift work. So in jet lag, obviously, you're taking someone presumably with a stable day-night cycle, but then you're moving them to somewhere where there's a different day-night cycle, because obviously we have our time zones. And shift work disorder is fundamentally the same thing, but with the additional wrench of you're deliberately offsetting your sleep cycle from like your environment. But obviously there are lots of professions, including medical professions, where it's really important to have people who are wide awake at 2 in the morning, like performing sort of life-saving jobs and so on. Other types of sleep disorders include narcolepsy, where people have uncontrolled falling asleep, even with sort of adequate sleep, and this is actually thought to be down to a deficit of those orexin secreting neurons that we talked about right at the beginning. And then there's sleep disorders related to breathing, and obstructive sleep apnea is the most common of these, where periodically there's an obstruction to the airflow, which obviously like you'll be glad to know even though you're asleep, your brain does want you to stay alive. And so it'll say, okay, scrap the sleep, we're choking. And so you get woken up by this collapse of the airway. And so this will often lead to pronounced high blood pressure. And it's, like moderately common, and typically it's seen in people with obesity problems, and also older people. And this is actually because it's like fundamentally the thing that's disrupting sleep is just the collapse of the airway. People sleep with these sort of masks that provide continuous positive airway pressure in order to keep the airway inflated, so that then they don't have this problem. And then so I will not ask any questions in these last 2 slides, but just for completeness, one of the major ways of dealing with sort of sleep disorders is quote unquote sleep hygiene, where basically you're trying to just have a good regimen for going to sleep, where you don't get yourself into a hyper alert state right before trying to fall asleep. You have set sleep times and so on. And you can sort of actually use bright light therapy during awake times in order to sort of help with the sort of entrainment of the day-night cycle. And you can also use things like some of these melatonin drugs in order to entrain the sort of circadian rhythm. We've already mentioned sort of antihistamines having making people drowsy through their inhibition of this sort of wakefulness histaminergic signaling. And again, I won't be asking questions on this, but you will have plenty of opportunity to learn more about these in the next couple of years. There are obviously many other prescription drugs that are used as sleep aids, and they, and it's pretty important that they're, or at least ideally, they should never be used long term, because you develop dependence, and they also do give rise to this sort of abnormal sleep architecture. So it's not like the same quality of sleep that you'd get naturally.